What happens when a legendary actor known for some of the most intense performances in cinematic history walks onto a daytime talk show? And within minutes, the conversation turns so cold, so sharp, that the entire studio falls silent. That's exactly the moment viewers witnessed when Al Pacino sat down across from Whoopi Goldberg on The View. At first, it looked like any other celebrity appearance. The lights were bright. The audience was excited. The hosts were smiling as they introduced the legendary guest. But what no one expected was how quickly the warmth in the room would disappear. Before we step into this intense moment, make sure to subscribe to The Truth Narrator, like this video, and leave a comment below telling us what you think about these powerful celebrity moments. Because the story you're about to hear shows how quickly a friendly interview can turn into something far more unforgettable. The studio audience erupted with applause as Al Pacino walked out onto the stage. Even after decades in Hollywood, there was something magnetic about him. His presence carried the quiet intensity of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding attention on screen. He waved gently to the crowd. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just a small nod. The kind of acknowledgement that said he appreciated the applause, but wasn't particularly interested in being the center of spectacle. The hosts welcomed him warmly. "Ladies and gentlemen," one of them said with excitement, "please welcome the legendary Al Pacino." The applause grew louder. Pacino sat down at the table, facing the panel of hosts, including Whoopi Goldberg, who watched him with a curious half-smile. For the first few minutes, everything felt relaxed. They talked about his long career, the films, the characters, the decades of storytelling that had made him one of the most respected actors in the world. Pacino answered with his usual quiet charm, sometimes reflective, sometimes humorous. At one point, he leaned back in his chair and said with a soft laugh, "I never expected to still be doing this after all these years." The audience laughed warmly, but Whoopi Goldberg tilted her head slightly. "Why not?" she asked. Pacino shrugged. "Well, I thought I'd run out of things to say." The audience chuckled again, but Whoopi didn't laugh. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her tone shifting just enough that some people in the audience noticed. "You've played a lot of powerful characters," she said. Pacino nodded. "That's true. Men with influence," Whoopi continued. "Men with authority." Pacino's expression remained calm. "That tends to happen in movies." A few audience members laughed, but Whoopi didn't smile. "Do you ever worry," she asked carefully, "that some of those characters shaped how people view power in real life?" The question hung in the air. Pacino blinked slowly. "Movies reflect life," he said quietly. Whoopi raised an eyebrow. "Or they influence it." A murmur rippled through the audience. The tone had shifted. Not dramatically, but enough that people leaned forward in their seats. Pacino folded his hands together on the table. "That's a philosophical debate," he said calmly. Whoopi nodded. "And we're having it." The audience laughed nervously. Pacino smiled slightly, but his eyes remained thoughtful. "Actors tell stories," he said. Whoopi leaned closer. "Yes, but sometimes," she said, "those stories shape the culture around them." Pacino looked at her for a moment before answering. "That may be true." The audience murmured. Whoopi continued. "You've played gangsters, powerful businessmen, men who control entire systems." Pacino nodded. "Yes. So when audiences admire those characters," she said, "do you ever wonder what message that sends?" The question landed heavier than the previous ones. Pacino's expression didn't change, but he didn't answer immediately either. The pause stretched just long enough that people began to feel the tension building. Finally, he spoke. "People admire complexity," he said quietly. Whoopi tilted her head. "Or power." Pacino's eyes sharpened slightly. The room seemed to grow quieter. "Those aren't the same thing," he replied. A few audience members clapped softly. Whoopi noticed the reaction but didn't respond to it. Instead, she asked another question. "One thing people often say about Hollywood," she began, "is that it glorifies certain types of power." Pacino leaned back slightly. "Hollywood glorifies storytelling." Whoopi shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "It glorifies influence." The room grew still. Pacino studied her for a moment. "You're suggesting actors are responsible for how audiences interpret characters." Whoopi met his gaze. "Aren't they?" The audience shifted in their seats. Some people whispered to each other, because suddenly the conversation didn't feel like a casual interview anymore. It felt like a debate. Pacino leaned forward slowly. "I think audiences are smarter than we give them credit for." Whoopi smiled faintly. Sometimes. The tension tightened. But sometimes, she continued, people imitate what they admire. Pacino's voice dropped slightly. Then the problem isn't the story. The audience waited. It's the way we understand it. A few people clapped. But the applause faded quickly when Whoopi asked the next question. You've been in this industry for decades, she said. Pacino nodded. You've seen the way Hollywood changes. Yes. Whoopi leaned forward again. So tell me something honestly. Pacino watched her carefully. Go ahead. Whoopi's voice grew quieter. Do you think Hollywood has always been honest about the kind of influence it has on the world? The room went completely silent. Pacino didn't respond immediately. He looked down briefly at the table, then back at Whoopi. His expression had changed. The warmth from earlier was gone, replaced by something colder, more serious. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made several people in the audience shift uncomfortably. Honesty, he said slowly, is a dangerous word in Hollywood. The audience gasped softly. Whoopi's eyebrows lifted. Why dangerous? Pacino leaned forward slightly. Because once you start talking honestly. He paused. The silence stretched across the room. Then he finished the sentence in a calm, chilling tone. You might not like what you hear. The studio fell completely silent. Even the hosts seemed unsure how to react. And for the first time since the interview began, it became clear to everyone watching The View that this conversation between Al Pacino and Whoopi Goldberg was about to become something far more intense than anyone expected. For several seconds after those chilling words, the studio stayed silent. Not the polite silence of a talk show pause, but the heavy, uncertain silence of a room that suddenly realizes something serious is happening. The cameras were still rolling. The lights were still bright. But the energy had changed completely. Across the table on The View, Whoopi Goldberg leaned back slightly in her chair, studying Al Pacino with a new expression. Curious, careful, almost cautious. Pacino sat calmly, his hands resting lightly on the table. His face was unreadable, but there was a sharpness in his eyes now that hadn't been there before. Whoopi finally broke the silence. Well, she said slowly, that sounded ominous. A ripple of uneasy laughter passed through the audience. Pacino gave a small shrug. Sometimes truth sounds that way. The room quieted again. One of the other hosts glanced between them, sensing the tension but unsure whether to interrupt. But Whoopi kept her attention fixed on Pacino. You said honesty is dangerous in Hollywood, she continued. That's a pretty strong statement. Pacino nodded. Yes. Why? She asked. Pacino exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. Because Hollywood, he said carefully, is built on stories. The audience listened closely. And stories, he continued, are powerful. They shape how people see the world. Whoopi nodded slightly. That's exactly what I was saying earlier. Pacino tilted his head. Yes, he said quietly. But there's another part to it. He paused. The studio lights reflected faintly in his eyes as he looked out at the audience for a moment before continuing. Stories aren't always meant to be comfortable. The audience murmured. Whoopi folded her hands together. But are they always honest? She asked. Pacino looked back at her. That depends on who's telling them. Another pause. Whoopi leaned forward again. So you're saying Hollywood doesn't always tell the truth? Pacino smiled faintly. I'm saying Hollywood tells the truth people are willing to hear. The audience reacted with a mixture of murmurs and soft applause. Whoopi raised her eyebrows. That sounds like a polite way of saying something else. Pacino chuckled softly. Maybe it is. The tension in the room was building again. The conversation had moved far beyond movie promotion now. This wasn't about a film release. This was something deeper. Whoopi shifted in her seat. You've seen the industry change a lot over the years, she said. Different movements, different conversations about accountability. Pacino nodded slowly. That's true. And yet, she added carefully, some people feel Hollywood still protects certain narratives. Pacino looked thoughtful. That might be true. The audience leaned forward. But then he added something that made several people glance at each other. Every industry protects its narratives. The room buzzed softly. Whoopi tilted her head. That sounds a little cynical. Pacino shrugged. Experience tends to do that. A few audience members laughed quietly. But Whoopi didn't. She was watching him closely now, almost as if trying to decide how far to push the conversation. You've played characters who hold enormous power, she said again. People who manipulate systems, control outcomes. Pacino nodded. Yes. So let me ask you something directly, she said. Pacino waited. Do you think power in Hollywood works the same way? The audience reacted instantly. A wave of murmurs moved through the crowd, because everyone understood what she was really asking. Pacino didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the table for a moment, tapping his finger lightly against the surface. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. Power exists anywhere influence exists. The audience listened closely. Whoopi leaned forward again. And Hollywood has influence. Pacino nodded. Yes. So who holds the power? She asked. The question hung in the air like a spark waiting for fuel. Pacino looked directly at her. More people than you think. Whoopi's eyes narrowed slightly. That's not really an answer. Pacino smiled faintly. It's the most honest one. The audience chuckled nervously. But Whoopi wasn't finished. Some people say actors benefit from that system, she continued. Pacino nodded. Of course we do. The bluntness of the response surprised several audience members. Actors are part of the system, he added calmly. Whoopi raised her eyebrows. So you admit that? Pacino shrugged. It's not exactly a secret. The audience laughed softly. But the tension was still there, hanging just beneath the surface. Whoopi leaned back slightly. Then let me ask you something else. Pacino waited patiently. You've played some of the most iconic characters in film history, she said. Men who walk into a room and everyone goes quiet. The audience laughed again. Pacino smiled faintly. That's the movies. But right now, Whoopi said, gesturing around the studio, we're in the real world. The room grew quiet again. And in the real world, she continued, people want accountability. Pacino nodded slowly. That's fair. But accountability requires honesty, she said. Pacino met her gaze again. And honesty requires courage. The audience murmured. Whoopi studied him carefully. Are you saying Hollywood lacks courage? Pacino paused. The silence stretched. For a moment, it looked like he might avoid the question entirely. But then he leaned forward slightly. I'm saying courage comes with consequences. The audience reacted instantly. A few gasps. A few whispers. Because the way he said it didn't sound theoretical. It sounded personal. Whoopi noticed that too. Her voice softened slightly. Consequences like what? Pacino looked out at the audience again. Then back at the hosts. His expression was calm. But there was something colder behind it now. Like losing the things people spend their entire careers trying to build. The audience went silent again. Whoopi nodded slowly. So you're saying people stay quiet because they're afraid? Pacino didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gave a small, almost tired smile. I'm saying people are human. The tension in the room felt thicker now, because the conversation had moved into dangerous territory, and everyone in the studio could feel it. Whoopi tapped her fingers lightly against the table. Then she asked the question that would push the interview even further. If someone like you decided to be completely honest about Hollywood. She paused. The audience leaned forward. What would people hear? Pacino looked directly at her. For several seconds, he didn't speak. And in that silence, the entire studio seemed to hold its breath. Because something about the way Al Pacino was looking at Whoopi Goldberg suggested that whatever came next might change the tone of this interview forever. The silence after that question felt heavier than anything that had come before. For a moment, no one moved. The cameras were still rolling on the view, but the usual rhythm of daytime television had completely disappeared. The laughter, the quick transitions, the comfortable energy gone. All eyes were on Al Pacino. Across the table, Whoopi Goldberg waited calmly, but even she seemed aware that the interview had crossed into unfamiliar territory. Pacino sat still, his fingers loosely folded together on the table. Then slowly, he leaned forward. You really want to know? He asked quietly. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the audience. Whoopi didn't laugh. Yes, she said. Pacino nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the seriousness of what she had asked. You asked what people would hear if someone like me spoke honestly about Hollywood. He paused. The studio lights reflected in his eyes as he glanced briefly toward the audience. First, he continued, they'd hear that the industry is built on dreams. The audience nodded. That's the part everyone loves. A few people clapped softly. Pacino continued. But the second thing they'd hear. He stopped. The pause stretched. Is that dreams are expensive. The room grew quiet again. Whoopi tilted her head slightly. What do you mean by that? Pacino gave a faint smile. I mean, people sacrifice a lot for those dreams. Actors? She asked. Pacino shrugged. Actors. Writers. Directors. Crew members. He gestured lightly around the studio. Everyone. The audience listened closely. But sometimes, Pacino added quietly, people sacrifice more than they expected. The words hung in the air. Whoopi leaned forward again. That sounds like regret. Pacino shook his head slowly. No. Then what is it? She asked. Pacino thought for a moment before answering. It's perspective. The audience murmured softly. Whoopi studied him carefully. You've been in Hollywood for decades, she said. Long enough to see people rise and disappear. Pacino nodded. That happens everywhere. But Hollywood magnifies it, she said. Pacino didn't disagree. Fame is a spotlight, he replied. And spotlights don't last forever. A few audience members nodded. But Whoopi wasn't finished yet. You mentioned courage earlier, she said. The courage to be honest. Pacino nodded. Yes. So let's talk about that. The room went quiet again. Because people watching this show, Whoopi continued, are probably wondering what kind of honesty you're talking about. Pacino exhaled slowly. Honesty about how the system works. Which system? She asked. Pacino smiled faintly. You know the one. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. But Whoopi didn't smile. The one where influence matters more than talent? She asked. The question landed sharply. Pacino didn't react immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying her. You're asking me to confirm something people have believed for years. Whoopi nodded. Are they wrong? Pacino paused. Then he answered carefully. Talent opens doors. The audience waited. But influence decides how long they stay open. Several people in the audience gasped softly. Even some of the other hosts shifted in their seats. Whoopi raised her eyebrows. That's a bold statement. Pacino shrugged. It's a realistic one. The tension in the room thickened again. Because suddenly the conversation wasn't just philosophical. It was personal. Whoopi leaned forward again. So are you saying Hollywood isn't fair? Pacino gave a quiet chuckle. Nothing involving power is ever completely fair. The audience murmured again. But that doesn't mean it's evil, he added quickly. Whoopi tilted her head. So what is it? Pacino looked out at the audience for a moment. Then back at the hosts. It's human. The answer was simple. But the way he said it carried weight. Whoopi nodded slowly. Human systems can still hurt people. Pacino didn't argue. That's true. And sometimes, she continued, people inside those systems stay quiet. Pacino looked directly at her again. Sometimes silence is survival. The room reacted instantly. Several audience members gasped. Because that answer felt raw, honest, and maybe a little dangerous. Whoopi noticed the reaction too. So you're saying people in Hollywood stay quiet because they're protecting themselves? Pacino didn't deny it. Sometimes. The studio grew quieter than ever. Then Whoopi asked the question that pushed everything even further. And you, she said. Pacino's eyes narrowed slightly. What about me? She leaned forward. You've been part of the system for 50 years. Pacino nodded. Yes. So have you ever stayed quiet about something you believed was wrong? The audience gasped. Even some of the hosts looked shocked by how direct the question was. Pacino didn't answer immediately. For the first time in the entire interview, his calm expression seemed to shift slightly. Not anger. Not frustration. Something deeper. Something more reflective. He leaned back in his chair and looked up toward the studio lights for a moment. Then he looked back at Whoopi. Yes, he said quietly. The audience went completely silent. The honesty of the answer surprised everyone. Whoopi blinked. You're admitting that? Pacino nodded slowly. Yes. Why? She asked. Pacino took a long breath before responding. Because sometimes you don't understand the weight of a moment until years later. The audience listened closely. When you're younger, he continued, you think survival means staying in the game. He tapped the table lightly. But eventually you realize the game changes. Whoopi's voice softened. And what happens then? Pacino looked directly at her. Then you decide whether you're still playing or finally speaking. The tension in the room felt electric now, because it was clear the conversation had reached a point where anything could happen next. Whoopi studied him carefully. Are you speaking now? Pacino gave a faint smile. That depends on how much honesty this show can handle. The audience gasped. Some laughed nervously. But the mood in the studio had changed completely. Because suddenly it felt like the next few moments between Al Pacino and Whoopi Goldberg might push this interview further than anyone at The View had planned. For a moment after those words, the studio seemed to stop breathing. The audience inside The View looked from one side of the table to the other, unsure what would happen next. Even the hosts appeared slightly stunned. Because when Al Pacino said, "That depends on how much honesty this show can handle," it didn't sound like a joke. It sounded like a challenge. Across from him, Whoopi Goldberg slowly leaned back in her chair. For the first time since the interview began, she didn't respond immediately. She studied Pacino with a thoughtful expression, as if deciding whether to push forward or pull the conversation back. The silence stretched. A few nervous laughs came from the audience. One of the other hosts shifted slightly in her chair, glancing toward the producers off camera. But Whoopi raised her hand gently, signaling that the conversation wasn't over yet. "You know," she said slowly, "people come on this show all the time." Pacino nodded. "Yes, and we ask questions," she continued. "That's your job. But most of the time," she said, "people give very careful answers." A few audience members laughed. Pacino gave a small smile. "That's Hollywood." More laughter. But Whoopi didn't smile this time. "You don't sound very careful today." Pacino looked at her calmly. "Maybe I'm too old to be careful." The audience burst into laughter and applause. Even Whoopi smiled briefly. But the tension was still there. She leaned forward again. "So let's test that honesty," she said. Pacino nodded. "All right." Whoopi's tone became more serious. "You said earlier that influence decides how long doors stay open in Hollywood." Pacino nodded slowly. "Yes. So let me ask you something very directly." The audience leaned forward again. "Do you think Hollywood is changing?" Pacino thought about the question for a moment. Then he answered, "Yes." The audience murmured. Whoopi tilted her head. "Changing for the better?" Pacino paused. "That depends on what people do with the change." The answer hung in the air. Whoopi watched him closely. "You're still being careful," she said. Pacino smiled faintly. "Old habits." The audience laughed again. But Whoopi wasn't done yet. "You've been part of this industry longer than most people sitting here," she said, gesturing toward the panel. Pacino nodded. "That's true. So if you had to give one honest message to the next generation of actors, what would it be?" The room grew quiet again. This time, the silence felt different. Less confrontational. More reflective. Pacino leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. For several seconds, he didn't speak. The audience watched him carefully. Finally, he answered, "Don't confuse fame with truth." The simplicity of the sentence caught everyone off guard. Even Whoopi blinked. "What do you mean?" she asked. Pacino leaned forward again. "Fame is loud," he said. He gestured toward the cameras. "The spotlight is loud." The audience nodded. "But truth," he continued quietly, "is usually very quiet." The room fell silent. "Sometimes," he added, "the quiet voices are the ones people should listen to the most." A few audience members began clapping. Then more joined. Within seconds, the entire studio audience applauded. Even some of the hosts nodded thoughtfully. Whoopi watched Pacino for a moment before speaking again. "That might be the most philosophical answer we've had on this show in a long time." Pacino shrugged gently. "I've had a long time to think." The audience laughed. But there was also respect in the room now. Because what had started as a tense conversation had turned into something deeper. Whoopi leaned back in her chair again. "Well," she said with a small smile, "I guess honesty didn't destroy the show after all." Pacino chuckled softly. "Not today." The audience laughed again. But the moment stayed with them. Because even though the conversation had softened, the tension from earlier still lingered in the air. And viewers watching at home could feel it too. Within minutes of the interview ending, clips from the conversation between Al Pacino and Whoopi Goldberg began spreading across social media. People debated every line. Some viewers praised Pacino's honesty. Others defended Whoopi for asking tough questions. Comment sections exploded with opinions. One viewer wrote, "That was the most real interview I've seen on daytime TV." Another said, "Whoopi pushed him hard, but he handled it like a legend." Clips of Pacino saying, "Honesty is a dangerous word in Hollywood," were shared thousands of times. Even entertainment journalists started discussing the moment. Was it a confrontation? A debate? Or simply two strong voices challenging each other in a rare moment of unscripted television? Whatever the answer was, one thing became clear. It was unforgettable. And moments like that remind us why conversations between powerful personalities can become some of the most compelling stories on television. But now we want to hear from you. What do you think about this intense moment between Al Pacino and Whoopi Goldberg on The View? Did Pacino speak with powerful honesty? Or did Whoopi ask the questions everyone was thinking? Tell us your opinion in the comments below. And if you enjoy powerful celebrity stories like this one, make sure you subscribe to The Truth Narrator, like this video, and stay tuned for more dramatic and unforgettable moments from the world of entertainment.